going to begin our cutting tutorials with a simple cross cut, and then I'll do a few variations on the cross cut, giving you a couple of different examples of the types of cuts you make with a cross cut and how to safely perform each action. I do want to remind you that whenever we work at the table saw, you must use a guide. So you can use the fence for rib cuts or you can use the miter gauge for cross cuts, but you must use one or the other. Also, you can't use both at the same time. It would be a very dangerous operation to cut a board using both the fence and the miter gauge, because it's very easy for this piece on the side over here to cockeye just a little bit, get caught in the blade, and come flying out at you. So while that could damage the teeth of the blade and let them come flying out, it could also just damage the blade, or it could just send the piece flying out at you. So again, you must use either the miter gauge or the rip fence, but you would never use both at the same time. I will show you an operation where we kind of cheat and use both, but that's a little bit more advanced and we'll get to that in a step or two, okay? So for right now, we're just gonna do a very simple cross cut. First step we wanna do is make sure our miter gauge is set up. We're gonna adjust the blade so that it is 1/2 or 1/8 of an inch over your board. So I'm gonna drop it down to the appropriate height. I'll go ahead and put my guard in place, and SawStop has this little metal guard to keep your hand from going in also, so we'll put that one in place. Okay, I'm not going to do a specific cut length on this one. I'm just going to true up the end, so it doesn't matter where I cut it. When I hold this, I want to make sure that I'm holding a finger down on the board and the rest of my fingers are squeezing back into the miter gauge. So that way I'm holding it down and back. And if this board were to get ripped out of my hands, my hand would naturally clench back right onto the miter gauge, not get pulled into the saw. Okay, so my right hand is on the handle, my left hand is going to be holding this in place, preventing this kind of motion from happening, which will hopefully prevent kickback. And I'm either going to go all the way through and wait for it to stop, and then I can pull it back, or what's better is to pull it sideways and then come back. Okay? It's always safer to not go past the blade again. Another temptation, this little piece here, this cutoff, is going to be sitting here dangling on the saw, might even be vibrating. Do not touch that piece. This is one of the main ways people get cut on the table saw, is they reach for those little scraps. The little scraps move into the blade just ever so slightly. The blade will grab it and pull their hand into it. So it's critical to never ever grab those little pieces that are left on the side. Turn the saw off, wait for it to stop, and then collect them. The next cross cut that we're going to make is a very common procedure that you're going to need to make on the table saw, and that is to make multiple pieces to the exact same length. I do want to preface this by saying it's much easier, safer, and faster to do all cross cuts on the miter saw. It's very rare that the table saw is a better choice for doing a cross cut. There are a few exceptions, and sometimes it's just convenient to use your saw because maybe the miter saw has a special setup in it or something like that. So there's nothing wrong with doing cross cuts on the table saw, but in general the miter saw is inherently a better tool for making cross cuts, and I would recommend using that whenever you can. So now, how do we make multiple cuts to the same size? Again, a very common operation on the table saw. I did tell you that we cannot use the miter gauge and the fence at the same time, which is too bad because it's really convenient to set this fence. So let's say I need to make this 3-inch cut. It's very convenient to just set the fence up to 3 inches to make my cut, butt this right up against the fence, and then make a cut. Unfortunately, what's going to happen is, as that board goes through, it's likely to cockeye a little, and then it's going to get grabbed in the blade and thrown out of it. So here's a simple cheat to get around that. So I know I need to make this 3 inches. So I've made a little scrap piece that is 9 inches plus my 3 will equal 12. So I can set this fence up to 12 inches, and now I can just double check to make sure my measurements came out right. Just double check that this fits in there perfectly. It does. So now I can pull all of this out of here. I'm going to put this little stick at the back here. Then I'm going to butt this board right up against it. Okay, so again, I'm going to butt this board right up against the fence, make sure it's perfectly straight, make sure this is flat against the fence of the miter gauge. I'm going to slide this over, and that's going to put it at exactly the length I need to cut that piece. So now I can get rid of this sample, and now I want to hold this board in position, and I'm going to remove this board out of here. I want to get rid of it. I do not want to leave it there, okay? If I leave it there, it's likely to get dragged along. So now that I've got this thing ready to cut, I'll go ahead and make a cut. I'm going to push all the way through until I'm past the blade, turn the saw off, and wait for it to come to a complete stop. Remember, another option would be to just slide that to the side. So we're going to pull this piece out, and what we end up with is a piece that's the same exact size. Okay? So I'll go ahead and make a couple of those real quick just so you could see. Again, we're just going to butt it down to the right size back here. Pull that board out, make our cut. All the way through, slide the board to the side, come over here, butt it up against my board. Pull it out. And so on and so on. So that technique was fine when we were cutting all of these little skinny pieces to the exact same size. But what happens if we need to cut a wider board? For instance, this board here, I can't grip it and hold my thumb against the miter gauge here. I don't have that option because it's too wide. So let's get set up for this cut. First thing we're going to want to do is set the blade height to the right height. Again, 1/2 or 1/8 of an inch over it. Okay? I'm just going to trim up this edge so I don't really care exactly where I'm hitting it, so I don't have to measure. I'm going to slide this board over, and I'm actually going to put it up under the fence a little bit just because it's so wide. I don't want it hanging off of the table saw and flopping around back there. If it flops around too much, it gives me an uneven cut and it's not very safe. So again, I'm going to start it. It's not touching the blade yet. I never would want to start it touching the blade. So it's about 1.5 inches away from the blade. 1.5 inches, 2 inches away. And I'm just doing that to make sure my miter gauge is more stable. Now the way I'm going to hold this one is I'm going to put my hand here. I'm going to palm holding the board down and my fingers holding the board backwards. I'm also going to tuck my thumb. No sense in having my thumb be extra close to the blade. I want this thing to be tucked away from the board, or tucked away from the blade. Okay? And when I use this motion, I'm going to zoom the camera out so you can kind of see it, what I'm doing. So again, we're going to anchor this right hand to the miter gauge so that it's safe. To make this left hand safer, what I need to do is I'm going to tuck my elbow and tie it into my ribs. Okay? That's a very important concept. We do that a lot in woodworking, is we tie our arm to our body so that it's not easily pulled away. Okay, so I'm going to tie that to my body. That way, as my body moves, so does my arm. And it makes it a lot harder for the tool to pull my arm away from my body. And that makes the tool have a lot more work because it has to pull my whole body into the saw if it wants to cut me. So I'm going to tie my arm into my side, tuck it into my ribs, keeping it close to my body where all my power is. Okay? So I'm pulling this thing back, pushing down, pulling back. And when I go ahead and make my cut, that's the motion that I want. And I'm doing that so that if something were to go wrong, my natural reaction is to do this. Is to pull back, because that's the motion I'm already doing before I even start the cut. So again, I'm going to hold this thing down and back and go ahead and make my cut. Tuck that in, tight, go. Going to drag it all the way past the blade before I stop. I'll wait for the saw to stop, and then I can take my board out of position. Alternately too, I could slide it past, slide the board to the side, and then reset for another cut if I needed to. That's going to conclude the demonstrations for the crosscut. Again, leave those boards on the table until the blade completely stops. Once the blade is stopped, then it's safe to go get those little pieces out of there. What you really need to be careful of is every time you think you're going to grab that and pull it away, what can happen is I go to knock this thing away, and your finger's going to push this into the blade. It'll just be sitting there. You'll go to grab it to move it away, but what you'll accidentally do is push this into the blade. It will grab, and then it will pull your hand in. So it's a very common way that people get cut. So make sure you do not try to grab those little pieces that are left on the table saw until that blade is stopped. Okay?